Public Building Award, an RIBA European Award. Currently, FAT is exhibiting at the Walker Gallery in Minneapolis in the exhibit entitled Worlds Away, New Suburban Landscapes. As a founding director of FAT, Sam was trained as an architect first at the Mackintosh School in Glasgow and then later at the Bartlett in London. And currently Sam is in charge of the Hoogvliet, I like to say that, I like to not be able to say that, Hoogvliet project in the Netherlands, a park with a mixed-use community center, due for completion next month. He's taught and lectured at universities in Europe and the US, and most recently was running a studio at Yale School of Architecture this past fall. In addition to his own publications, Sam is also the architecture editor of Contemporary and the editorial advisor of Icon magazine. One of the most interesting things to see, I think, in architecture is how movements that one thought were totally without merit and beyond reproach can somehow get revived in surprising and compelling ways. How a history that we thought we were happily over can come back to strike us in new ways. And in some ways, I think FAT has done that with postmodernism, setting off new trajectories from very unlikely sources and making us realize that there was something in that work that many of us had too quickly dismissed. Much of their work extends a humor and ease that's much needed today, and it displays some of the wit that we saw last semester in the work that Momoyo showed from Etaye Bow Wow, or with Neutling's Riedick, or even Stanley Tigerman, who began the lecture series in September. This is, I think, in part accounted for by the fact that Sam said that one of the early sources for their office research was the architectural remainder bins, where they could pick up cheaply all those Pomo Rizzoli monographs from the mid-'80s. So that was their founding research source. In any case, I think as one of the founding cities of postmodernism, if not the founding city of postmodernism, it's interesting to see how that work or how our history could be deflected in a new way. So please join me in welcoming Sam Jacob, whose lecture tonight is called All You Can Eat to Chicago, which appropriately is the fattest city in the country. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes, fat and all you can eat. I should probably start by saying that FAT was never really intended to be an architectural office. We started a little bit before 1995. We started in the last recession, which was either the most stupid thing you could possibly do, or the greatest thing you could do. But we started without any ambition to be a firm that builds stuff. What we wanted to be was a magazine. And FAT, Fashion Architecture Taste, was the name of the magazine. We didn't get much further than the name. We did a cover and a really bad application to a funding body, which they rejected very quickly. So the name stuck. But I think there's something in the name, and perhaps also in the idea of a magazine. Magazines are very voracious things. They've got a tremendous appetite for consuming stuff, for better or for worse. They're also the mechanism by which, I suppose, sort of taste is established and communicated and kind of coalesces. And we're interested very much in the sort of mechanisms of taste. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. In fashion, well, that was standing for kind of ephemera, as opposed to architecture as some kind of timeless art. So it was like the kind of things which would come and go very quickly. And architecture is in the middle, whatever architecture means. In relation to the name of FAT, I think the idea of consumption is really important. And being fat is, if you look at the statistics, kind of increasingly a contemporary phenomenon, almost a kind of fate that we're all going to. I know I'm certainly experiencing it, but it's kind of a cultural fate the way in which we live. And we know what happens to bodies, to physiology when you consume too much. And I suppose the question we're asking at FAT is, what happens to architecture when it consumes too much, when it gets a bit too greedy and eats things it shouldn't do? What does it turn into? Well, I'm going to show you some stuff which I think begins to explore some of these ideas. The lecture's organised into a series of sections which deal with either ideas or tactics, the kinds of things that we do. And one of the things which is really fundamental to the way we think about stuff is the idea of architecture and communication, which is definitely harking back to postmodern era architecture as media. And to sort of set the ball rolling with this, we made a sculpture, actually a house, as you can probably tell, made out of neon. And it's important it's made out of neon. Neon's the media by which the signs are made out of. But in this case, it's been manipulated to become three-dimensional. And what this is saying really is that a house isn't a machine for living in, it's information for living in. So here, it's the absolutely sort of typical profile of a house: pitched roof, chimney, little porch with maybe some honeysuckle growing around it, perhaps roses, who knows, a fireplace, and then the most important part of any house, the TV. So this is kind of an inversion of the modernist idea of architecture as something functional. This is something to do with information and communication. And I suppose the context for this is trying to think of the ways in which you might begin to understand architecture as something which is about communication rather than about technology or about construction. So we've got this idea about the unindustrial modern, that modernism was actually nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. It was to do with Marconi, it was to do with radio. And this is a vase. It's not quite as big as it is on the screen here, but it's pretty big. And it's made up of two profiles, as you can probably see as it goes around. Okay, so you've got a nose, mouth, chin, and the same on the other side. It's an old optical illusion, an old sort of surrealist thing. But the profiles on the one side is Mies van der Rohe, and the other side is Marconi. It kind of works quite well because Mies is big, fat, and Marconi is kind of skinny and pointy. So there's a nice contrast. And here's the profiles. So these are the two heroes of the invisible. So Mies is the sort of man who makes an architecture vanish into makes corners vanish, and walls vanishes, and so on. And Marconi, which might be the reason why Mies is doing this. And so it's to do with, it's maybe an idea of connection, of communication. So Marconi is allowing you to experience distant places, connecting various bits of geography together, which aren't physically together. And perhaps the same thing's happening within modernism itself. So rooms which were once separated become connected, interior, exterior become connected, and so on. And there it is, shiny thing. This was one of the first things that we built as a building. And it's a really explicit project about communication, about architecture, something which is just saying something, totally explicit. There's almost nothing else to it apart from what it's saying. It's pretty small. It's for a house and an office. It's classified by the planners in London as live work, and it's the kind of thing which usually happens in old warehouses, sort of loft living type scenarios. In this case, we were trying to invent, I suppose, a civic form for this typical city fringe activity. And it does it in a completely obvious way. There's a part of it which is the office. It's like a scaled down office block. And this part is the house, obviously. Kind of like South Park, if you like, so cut out of paper. It's almost, this part, I suppose, is like a billboard. You can see it goes into the garden. There's a little tree sticking out, which tells you that it's a garden. And it's super flat. It looks like you couldn't possibly live in it. Even flatter from the front, and super flat from one side. You know, it's just a facade here, just that thin line. But within this, I suppose, really simplistic architectural arrangement, there's certain complexities which are introduced. There's obviously changes in scale, so the scale of the house is different to the scale of the office. The office has been shrunken down. As the building goes around the corner, it's got a skyline attached to it. This is a bit of skyline which came from a postcard of Amsterdam. And this is related to the context. So at a certain point, the building's viewed from a busy road, so here it is being part of the townscape. It also becomes slightly more three-dimensional in a sort of, I suppose, theatrical way, as you see parts of it building up to make a kind of, I suppose, like a stage set. But inside the building's very different. It's like, I suppose, if you think of the black and white films where someone ends up behind the billboards in Times Square, something else happens behind these billboards too. There's gaps between the flat panels of the exterior and what happens on the interior. So here's a gap which is filled in with a bit of mesh, so you can experience this emptiness between the two. Behind the office facade, there's one room, which again is kind of playing with this idea of scale, what it looks like from the outside and how it's experienced on the inside is something very different. In this sense, in a very reduced way, this is like going up to the top of the Statue of Liberty and looking out of our hands. What's happening on the outside is very different to what's happening on the inside. Inside, it's much more complex spatially. In many ways, that project's kind of, I suppose, rhetorical. It's about architecture. It's about making an exercise of making very directly communication building. But there are many other ways in which communication is significant. And in this project, which is for some social housing in a regeneration project in Manchester, which is a town in the north of England, the idea of communication becomes almost a very important social act. The scenario was it's a big regeneration project, essentially demolishing an existing housing estate to replace it with metropolitan living. So these are kind of 5, 6, 7-story apartment blocks. But the existing community has to be moved to the middle of the site in order to allow all of this new development to occur. The residents are offered apartments in these beautiful new apartments, but they actually have no intention of living anything like that. There's no way. We're not going to live in a flat. We want to live in a house. This community is incredibly insular, very working class, and very suspicious of any kind of regeneration that might be happening to their community. So we were drafted in, I think, probably as the only architects who could possibly begin to engage with this really reduced idea of what a house should be or what housing should be like. We had big conflicts with them, arguments over whether a house could have 3 stories. They said no. We always said, sometimes it can have 3 stories. So it's a very closed idea of what a house could be. But we're interested in that. We're interested in the idea of what houses are supposed to look like. the first thing we did, we had 25, 26 resident families that we were kind of working for. In this case, the scenario was that they'd been given essentially the right to choose from a number of architects. So they've been given this quite a strong role in the design and in the future of what was going to happen to the project. They picked us, and we began to go and visit them. And when we went to visit them, we started to find these absolutely incredible interiors, things like this, things which are just almost impossible to imagine. This like half-timbered, adobe, fire, it's beyond the words. I don't know how on earth. But did you do it all in one go, or was this like over a few years? Who knows? But anyways, really incredible DIY culture. And all kinds of stuff like this. Which, as they were showing us around, they were saying, this is really important. And we're going, okay, this is really important. All kinds of aspirations. So here's the amount of furniture you'd have if you were living in a country estate and you were a lord, but shoved into this tiny council house. And really ingenious. It's a bar. It's a fish tank. And just some things that I don't know what that is. What's that? Flintstone or something like that. But also just kind of stuff which happens in houses. So this is a teenager marking out their own territory in a kind of temporary manner. The way in which a spare bedroom becomes used as an office. So we began to work very closely with them. We were forced. We had extra funding which forced us to spend an incredible amount of time with these people. We started just through a series of sketches. So this is a way of saying, okay, we recognise that the ceramic dog is a significant moment in the way you're thinking about a house. So this is us saying, we recognise that. That things become, kind of extra decorative, extra communicative. Looking at just simple relationships between different parts of the organisation of the house. Again, the idea that you might have like open plan living was like a total anathema. So it's kind of an interesting conversation when almost anything that's happened in 20th century architecture is just like ruled out. And it was actually very healthy for us, but when we had to go back a long, long way and start to try and work out what we could do. So here we were suggesting, okay, well, maybe you don't have a bedroom as an office, but you have a little bit just off the staircase where you can fit a computer in. Good relationships with gardens. And also, the organisation of the scheme as a whole. Remember I was saying that this is going to be surrounded by very large buildings full of yuppies drinking Chardonnay on their balconies, so on parking their Porsches in underground car parks. And these guys are kind of, they've lived there 35, 40 years. The kids have grown up there. It's a really significant place, which is going to be totally transformed. The idea that perhaps this could be arranged something which was sort of defensible architecture, something which like a castle or something like that, was significant. The second move was that the facade should maybe get bigger, because of course we were limited to, on the whole, 2 stories, because 3 stories on the house. So we managed to sneak in a couple of 3 stories, but in terms of the scale, if you've got an 8-story building next to it, a 2-story building is going to just kind of, it's going to be almost squashed by these Wilsot designed monstrosities in the eyes of the residents. So the facade becomes important. It becomes a little bit like a puffer fish, which under threat makes itself bigger. The arrangement's really simple, partly because the budget for social housing is very small, so there's kind of very little opportunity to do anything strange structurally. We knew that the builder that we were going to be working with was absolutely rubbish, because they always worked with this housing association, so they came as a sort of package, so that nothing would be kind of nicely made. It all had to be very kind of robust as a design principle. So the main design arrangements in terms of the plan had to do with kind of rooms with double aspect, that kind of thing. So we began to develop it in terms of this sort of thing wrapped around with this extra large facade, and the facade taking on characteristics which were kind of traditional. And I think it's that kind of bit which is important. It's the bit which makes it not, the bit which makes it not quite traditional, which is significant, I think. On the other hand, we had the developers in charge of the regeneration project saying, we want world-class architecture, really good design. So we're kind of torn between these two aspirations, which is a place that we really enjoy being. And so I think, there's a sort of tension between it being something which is different and it being something which is very familiar. As the design progressed, we started to look at various elements that could be, I suppose, used to kickstart the DIY culture that had been so wonderfully displayed in the front rooms of their previous homes. So we're looking at things like bird boxes and balconies and things for hanging basket off, window surrounds and so on, which we made into a kind of catalogue which the residents could then choose a certain number of each. So this was a way of starting to, for the residents themselves to start to personalise the houses. Just a word on materials. The site's very close to, you can see in the background, these big old mill buildings, which are, I suppose, a very early industrial revolution. So Manchester Mill, kind of, probably one time satanic, belching out noxious fumes. So there's an idea, the continuity of the material and the brick. There's also something to do with the pattern. The patterns applied within the brick at a very overscaled size. It's doing various things here. It's a sort of zigzag thing. It's been described as like Pringle jumpers. And what this is doing, I suppose, is referring to the way that mills, other large Victorian industrial structures have graphics patterns and become quite sort of layered in terms of the surface communication. On the background on the other side, you can see another vision of what social housing should be like. So this is a very different kind of project, partly because it was special because the developers had to move these guys out and they had to treat them well as a kind of media story for the developers. And partly because we received extra funding that allowed the project to be much more engaged with the people who were going to be inhabiting the homes. So very different from the 1950s and 1960s idea of provision of social housing. You can see the pattern runs across the surface of the buildings. It doesn't really work in terms of the ridgeline of the facade. But what it's doing is starting to relate to particular vistas which are set up due to the rest of the development. And what you have is this big difference between the facade and what's behind it. So here communication is being used as a way of, I suppose, allowing a particular group to identify themselves within an urban context. So it's like, I suppose, incredibly large-scale graffiti made out of brick. The dog survived. And this is the same guy who had the fish tank bar. The contractors built him a lovely fish pond in his backyard. We're also interested in the idea of event and how event is a significant architectural moment. one of the things we used to do when we didn't build stuff was we used to make architecture without any architecture. And this was really exploring the idea that actions themselves are architecture or architectural. This is a project called Shopping, and it used plastic bags as a site for art. We worked with, in an area of central London around Carnaby Street. We worked with 30 different shops, and we teamed them up with 30 different artists. Each artist made a design which was then reprinted onto these really cheap plastic bags, and something you'd think has absolutely no value whatsoever. And the bags were reproduced in a limited run of 1,000 each, mimicking the fine art print. In order to get one, you had to go to a particular shop and buy something, and you get the bag for free. And we had a range of artists involved, some of them incredibly well known, some of them still students. So we had people like the pop artist Peter Blake, we had Jake and Dinos Chapman, this was Julian Opie, as well as people who were still, kind of before their career had started. So the project's really dealing with an idea of, on the one hand, value. That's to say, this plastic bag, which has no intrinsic value, starts to acquire cultural value, perhaps financial value, due to its content, due to the fact it's got a Julian Opie on it or a Jake and Dinos Chapman on it or whatever. It's also to do with value in terms of, depending on how you look at it. If you know that it's the Chapman brothers, it becomes significant. If you don't, it remains a plastic bag. But it's also about an idea of how you can make architecture. We ran a whole series of these projects, which used lots of different sites, most of which existed already within the city. This is estate agent for sale signs, business cards, bus shelters, and so on, which were kind of co-opted as a site for art. And in various ways, these existing mechanisms which exist in the city, or things you do within the city, have this parasitic program attached to them. And somehow this program changes slightly both the way in which you're looking at art, or the way in which you're making art, but also how you're doing whatever it was you were doing within the city. So how you're waiting for the bus stop is transformed, because you're not looking at an advert, you're surrounded by a three-dimensional sculpture which has got a soundtrack, or in this case, an art gallery which walks down the road, gets on a bus, gets on a tube, and kind of disperses into the city. So the idea of event or function as narrative. I suppose this is a way of rethinking that kind of particularly claustrophobic idea of ergonomics, or a very strict interpretation of functionalism. But there are many ways to do the same thing. This is a project called Bathroom Suite. It was made for an exhibition. And the exhibition had a really terrible premise. It was supposed to promote British design in China, and it was organised by people called the British Council, who were supposed to promote British culture around the world. And their idea was that if you took very famous British celebrities and you designed a room for each of them in a house, this would be a great way for people to understand how creative Britain is. So there was like a room for Sherlock Holmes. I think we had these shorts for. We had David Beckham and Posh Spice. And I thought, oh my God, this is a terrible idea. So we've decided to do it. I don't know why. They're going to give us some money probably. And we thought we'd choose the bathroom. The bathrooms are fascinating places. They're like the sort of the crucible of modernism, the moment where the hygiene becomes so kind of significant. So we had David Beckham, Posh Spice, in the bathroom. Sounds like modern day Cluedo, isn't it? But instead of being interested in their kind of media presence, we were interested in the idea of their relationship, and saying how their relationship was perceived as this incredibly romantic, ongoing event, horrifically romantic. We thought, okay, well, this is a couple who can't bear to be apart. So here we have kind of two of everything. You've got two basins that have been sliced in half and put together. The same with the bath. The bath, of course, in plan makes a heart shape. The shower is intended to be a little bit like a Welsh love spoon. You know, these things kind of, they're wooden and they're carved, so they go round and round each other. It's apparently a gift from a Welsh man to a Welsh woman, symbol of love. And we thought, well, maybe the plumbing could do the same kind of thing. The plumbing could, this really dull bit of architecture could express this kind of horrible idea of romance, these pipes intertwining. And it's all made out of existing stuff. We put an order in the local harvest, delivered it. And you have these weird bits in bathrooms. Some couples have separate basins in the bathroom, two basins, so they can brush their teeth at the same time. I don't know one of those. That's a weird thing. But anyway, so this is kind of drawing on that as a way of thinking about bathrooms. So it's pretty sickly. Of course, at the other end, it's even worse. This is the point where you kind of suddenly think, oh my God, this is horrific. We never tried to work out exactly what you do with this, how you'd use it. So in that case, it's kind of like what do they call it? Narrative is a way of understanding functions. So the narrative of ridiculous love as a way of doing something is different from thinking about a bathroom, as a simple mechanism for making it cleaner. In an urban context, you could think of a similar sort of idea. The program is a scenario. This was a competition entry that we put in for what eventually was the wobbly bridge that links St Paul's with Tate Modern. And the competition was happening, I think, just after Princess Diana had died. And it was a time in London which was really weird. There were these massive areas covered with flowers, roads shut because of these carpets of rotting flowers. It's a really weird moment in what it's like to be in London. So we thought, well, this is such a significant moment that it needs to kind of be preserved and can be continued. Of course, it was eventually. There is a Diana memorial. We were thinking about it back in 1998, 7, whatever it was. The proposal really was very simple. It took a strip of Althorpe Park, which is where Diana was born and where she was eventually buried, dug it up, brought it to London and strung it across the Thames. And this is trying to do a number of different things. The first thing it's trying to do is set up a juxtaposition between the experience on the bridge and its surroundings. So you've got this picturesque English stately home landscape, which you can stand on when you're in the heart of Europe's financial centre. What it's also doing is saying, okay, well, the journey across a bridge, A to B, can be much more complex. It can be like walking around a capability Brown designed landscape. The idea of a promenade, the idea of a folly, and so on. It's also to do with allowing all that weird flower laying to continue. So here's some people laying flowers and helium balloons and other kinds of modern ways of engaging with memorial. And perhaps most importantly to us is that it's the opposite of high tech. That there's absolutely no problem with making this bridge stand up at all. Really simple. Of course, in Britain, every bridge is a challenge. Every bridge has to be held up in a different way. Eventually, this one was the wobbly bridge. It was so complicated it didn't even work. But we've been crossing rivers for thousands of years. It's not a problem. So the narrative of a bridge might not be just the fact it can be a bridge. It might not just be the fact that it's something held up over some water. It might be to do with how you get across it, what its cultural meaning is, what you might do on it, for example. And of course, this has got kind of in its old-fashioned bridgeness, it's got some carving along the side of it. So this text reads, "Goodbye, England's rose." It's Elton John's lyrics to his hastily released single. Sometimes function might be a performance. This is another anti-high-tech project. It's terrible being in Britain. Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, there's thousands of them. So this is a shed with its equipment on the outside. And the equipment allows the shed to be leafed. So with high tech, what you've got the interior, which is perfectly serviced by all the stuff that's stuck on the outside. Think of the Lloyd's one, for example. You see the lifts on the outside, air conditioning on the outside, pipes and so on, same with concrete. So all making the interior somehow habitable. This is doing the exact opposite. This is making the interior into a disaster zone. The moment you walk into a kitchen, you think, oh shit, I left the bath running this morning. Something like that. Which, if you kind of divorce the problems of thinking about the insurance company and how you get it fixed, is actually quite amazing. There's water coming down in a domestic scenario. It's quite a wonderful moment. This is about preserving that, making it into a sort of spectacle. With this mechanism, so you can see the pipe. This is our cheapskate high-techness. It sits on a tank, and it's got some pumps which are in the tank, and these pipes which lead up the outside, and the nozzles which come down, and the receptacles, kind of things you'd hastily assemble if your roof's leaking. So it's in a kind of event frozen by technology. Very cheap technology, it has to be said. Maybe sometimes experience is the function. This was another strange project. That was in the RIBA gallery, which usually never has any exhibitions, and it's a cake shop most of the time. But occasionally, once every couple of years, they have an exhibition in it. We were asked to make something. No brief, just whatever we want to do. We began to think about the idea of monuments. I think we often like to make monuments. We never know why we're making monuments, and that's what we make monuments about. So this was a structure which involves an airlock and an inflated ball. So the sort of half-timbered bit, essentially working like an airlock, and the big black thing is a really horrible inflated ball. It's like this really disgusting agricultural plastic, inflated to this slightly spherish shape, but it never quite gets to being a sphere because it's kind of wobbly. And when you go into the airlock, it kind of sags a bit and then you get bigger. It's kind of sort of unsettling. So you walk into the half-timbered thing, and you go up a staircase, you can see the little steps. And when you get into the middle of it, you're in this black, vast interior, what it seems like to be a vast interior. These little pinpricks of light, and you're looking up and you think, wow, they could be thousands of miles away. They look like constellations. You can tell that's what this guy's thinking, right? That's what she's thinking. So what this is based on is this absolutely fantastic Boulez drawing, design, whatever you want to call it, which is a cenotaph to Newton. It's a kind of monument to the Enlightenment. There's constellations mapped out in this huge stone sphere. Of course, ours was the opposite of stone, saggy, inflated. This in the middle of it. And instead of having constellations of the solar system marked on it, all of these little dots were taken from a map of Hollywood stars homes and wrapped onto this. So this, it's kind of a monument to nothingness. Well, this is a monument to a very significant moment. Ours was kind of more about a worry, I suppose. But you can see it being inflated. Like a big bollock, isn't it? It's horrible. But if architecture is about communication, and one of the most significant things is language. Language is the means by which you can form communication. One of the questions that we were asking quite a while ago, I think, was this idea of where is architectural content? What makes something architectural? One of the things that we were thinking about was this idea of taste, not space, which was really a reversal of the idea that architecture is about sculpting space. And absolutely made in opposition to mainstream architectural culture, which is about space. It's about making hysterical, sculpted objects with incredible spatial qualities within them. Just saying, okay, well, what is significant about architecture? If it's something about politics, if it's something about society, then perhaps it's not space that's significant, it's actually taste. And taste is the surface, not the space. And taste is the place where issues such as class, value, are revealed. It's the kind of thing you walk into somebody's house and you go, oh my God, this is so disgusting. Or, this is really nice. It's the mechanism by which you understand who someone is, and who you are, or why they're from you, and so on. It's about, I guess, design within society. So the mechanisms of taste, we think, certainly with this slogan, which is obviously a bit over the top, but it's there to exaggerate the point, is the idea that perhaps it's the surface, not the space. And it is very explicit. It's much easier to tell when it's bad taste than when it's good taste. If it's good taste, you kind of think, well, this is nice. If it's bad taste, you think, well, how could somebody possibly like this? Or, these guys have got too much money and not enough taste. And this tells you something about where you stand and where you think they stand. So the taste is a fairly explicit language, and architecture often operates like this. We're looking here at a thing called half timbering, which does that resonate with you? Do you know what I'm talking about? Half timbering. It's like an amazing phenomenon in the UK. It's the kind of thing which, if they want to build a big supermarket somewhere, the design will include a little bit of half timbering, and they'll say, "Wow, this looks incredibly contextual. Thank you very much for this." 60,000 square foot supermarket. But it's also got an incredible history to it. I'll run through the history in a second. What we did with it was try to end this history of half timbering. Because half timbering is used as a means of saying, okay, this building isn't a hideous mechanism of late capitalism. It's actually something which is connected to history and connected to context and connected to the idea of the vernacular. But it's being used as a means of, as a device to place it. So if this is being used as a kind of media, as a kind of a language, deployed as a language, then perhaps it should become language itself. So here it is, half timber font. This is actually available, so you can install it on your computer and write your letters to, well, I don't know, somebody you really want to impress. Even my letters are half timbered. I'm that historical. So it's a sort of architectural thing converted into something which is directly communicational. The origins of half timbering are very different. These are some drawings of old Saxon huts, and this is like in Germany, almost prehistoric, where it's a vernacular form of building. A lot of Saxons came to Britain as mercenaries for the Romans. So when the Romans occupied Britain, they weren't that interested in it, quite frankly. So they had all these Germans policing it. So this is 2,000 years ago, a little bit longer. And what you start to see is Saxon buildings being built in the UK. So this is like over 2,000 years ago. You've already got a building type which is nostalgic. It's being used as a sign, it's being used as a way of establishing kind of an identity. But it's an alien thing. So we're trying to, I think what's interesting here is that even 2,000 years ago, half timbering could be as inauthentic as it is now. And amazing things. But history of Britain, another invasion, Norman invasion. Amazing thing happens is that there's 100 castles built in 70 years by the Normans. This is a military occupation. The castles are all big stone things. This is the Tower of London. You know, really serious military hardware. So you think perhaps of Robin Hood, to think of the difference between the castle and the half-timbered house or pub, so the thing which is like kind of homely, community-oriented. Then you've got the Sheriff of Nottingham in the big stone castle. So here, half-timbering is the architecture of the people, not of the state. But later on, the Elizabethan times are now Britain becomes a very powerful force through its navy. And this is about making stuff out of wood, making these incredible boats out of wood. What you start to see is that the architecture of the state, the aristocracy and so on, starts to use half timbering in an incredibly elaborate way. So this is kind of very different to Robin Hood hanging around in a pub. This is something like, it's the equivalent of military high-tech spin-offs. Incredible craftsmanship used to make this stuff. The stuff with an amazing effect as well, demonstrating the incredible craftsmanship which is allowing Britain to become a significant independent place, allowing it to break with Rome, for example. Half timbering later on. This is early arts and crafts. What we're seeing here is a revival of half timbering as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. It's a revival of half timbering specifically because it's something to do with craft, it's something to do with historical moments, something to do with medieval times. You think of William Morris, for example, who's all about this revival of medievalism as a way of resisting the Industrial Revolution. Related to that, very close historically to that, is the Garden City movement. So you have the beginning of these new towns, which are built thanks to development technology such as the railways. And what they're saying is that you can have, for example, the health of the country, as it says here, or the comforts of the town. You can have this kind of fusion. So this moment is a kind of invention of the idea of the suburbs and the sort of pleasure, this land of pleasure, the kind of equation where you can take the good bits from various different parts of the city and place them together. So there's a sort of equation of pleasure, if you like. And of course, half timbering is used here as a device, as used to say, history. Between the wars, between the First World War and the Second World War, there's a big boom in the suburbs, but there's hardly any labour. Most of it's been killed, and there's hardly any money as well. So what you start to see is half timbering, which originally was structural all the way back here, like these sorts of things. Now it's tacked onto the outside. It's little slithers of wood. So it's no longer structural. It's just a sign. Also at this moment, it starts to be exported around the world. This is Jimmy Stewart's house, apparently, in Beverly Hills. So in the pages of magazines, like Country Life, really fashionable magazines like Country Life, you have these great spreads of Lutyens' houses, and Hollywood celebrities say, wow, that looks cool, I'll have one of those. And of course the vernacular is entirely unvernacular. Small windows to keep it warm. Well, where do you need to do that in California? Pitched roofs for all of the rain and so on. It's similar to the idea of Robin Hood. Here's one Robin Hood, we'll see another one in a second. So this is interwar suburban housing in Britain, so you can see how thin it's getting. Now reduced. This is one of my favourites, absolutely beautiful. I don't know how this happened. I think it's... I like that the drone pipes are kind of somehow employed in this attempt to half timber. That's like quarter timber, actually, isn't it? It's not half timber. So combinations of high technology and historical forms. So these Robin Hoods obviously saying the same thing. That it's, every time it's remade, it's not telling you about its historical source, it's telling you about contemporary ideas. So this is, well, Kevin Costner. No. This is, the idea of the minstrel is Bryan Adams walking through a forest playing an electric guitar. Somehow. Well, then, sometimes it is used historically. This is the recreation of the Globe Theatre on the South Bank of London. So this is like made vernacularly, recreating the oldie Shakespeare times. And it's used, this is from the transport manual. This is the roadside historic building, half timbered. And still, it has its international life. Although you can get exactly the same buildings in Spanish style, French style, so some Lego. And here we are back to the font again. This one has been painted onto a wall in the gallery, and it reads, you can only see some of it, so it reads, "Kill the modernist within," which is what we say to each other when we get into the office every morning. Must try and kill that modernist within this morning. Here the half timbering is just paint, the opposite of structure. Just a few microns thick, and it's all also simply about communication. So this was supposed to be the end of the history of half timbering. You don't have to do it because you've completed it. Another take on the idea of language is not what you're making, it's the way you're making it. This is a project, we ran a stall for a while called the Conrad Show, Terence Conran's this guy who brought modernism to the UK, running shops like Habitat and so on, which brought modern design to the masses. So these are tributes to high design moments. This was Jonathan Ives' first iMac, Lassie, coffee pots, and Philippe Starks, Juicy Salif, but all made really shittily out of clay, as you can see. So both the material and the way it's made is changing what it's saying. So I don't think this is any worse at squeezing lemons than Philippe Starks' lemon squeezer. It might even be better. Who knows? This is a project about too much stuff in the same place. It's an advertising agency in Amsterdam. We started with this picture, which we thought was the image that every young advertising executive aspires to be. Obviously a kind of big, backwoods, bear-trapping man. We'd met these guys a couple of years previously, and they'd gone back to Holland and bought a beautiful church. It was absolutely wonderful, but absolutely shit for being an office. Very tall. It's a listed monument, which meant we couldn't touch any of the walls. And they asked us to have a look at how we could convert it. We began to make them a catalogue. Really, a series of things which are kind of, on one hand, small buildings, on the other hand, really big bits of furniture. The idea being basically really practical is that if you didn't touch the walls and you let everything freestanding, it would be fine with the authorities. In Holland, a very sensible country, it is fine, you can do that. In Britain, it would be much more trouble if you tried to do anything within a historic context. We began to kind of dress these volumes up as a variety of different objects and sent them off to them saying, okay, which one do you like? Do you want to work in an aircraft carrier or a fort? Do you want an Arc de Triomphe or a diving board? And they were kind of ticking them and sending them back, doing crosses through themselves, which kind of gave us a series of things which we built. They're all built to different scales, so they kind of don't belong together. They also don't come from the same place. So although this project's very, like it's almost themed, apart from the fact there's no theme to it. So here you've got a little bit of shed that's been chopped off next to a bit of Wild West fort with a picnic table, a patch of football pitch, in the background a sort of lifeguard's tower. They're all really familiar objects, all very simple, with all things that you might have seen watching Saturday morning TV, probably. But they've all had some kind of strange transformation happen to them. So the shed's been chopped off, decapitated. The Wild West Fort's got these moments of refinement, like a kind of Georgian door surround attached to it. And the lifeguard tower's been gold-leafed. But they all operate at different scales, so as you walk from one, you look like a giant, and you walk into the next, you look like a very tiny person. But they use the volume of the church and they start setting up views through it. And it starts to be added to by the advertising. This is Lenin's, back of Lenin's head. There's the front of Lenin's head. Various parts of the church began to be used for things. They're big Ajax Amsterdam fans. This is where they watch big European games at the altar. So you have moments when these kind of objects which are themed within themselves interact with each other to make something which is like a kind of a story that you have to complete. What happened next? So it's space really made as a sort of collage, a three-dimensional collage. This is a view of, you can just see a what looks like a picnic table in there. It's actually the boardroom table, which is like an extra long picnic table. The main idea being that it's so uncomfortable you can't sit there for more than 15 minutes, so no meeting can last more than 15 minutes.
Welcome to the Church of Kessel's Kramer, a place where over 35 people from all over the planet work and play. Let us show you around. Thank you for visiting and have a safe journey home.
And we've worked a lot with the same company on various projects. They organised a really fantastic event, which was it was called the Other Final, and it took place on the same day as the World Cup soccer final. But this was between the two worst teams in the world, who were at the time Montserrat and Bhutan. Montserrat's this volcanic island which erupted not that long ago, which meant there was actually nowhere to play football at all. And Bhutan at the time was this closed, strange Tibetan Buddhist community. There's no wonder they're both rubbish at football. Anyway, they organised this game. They asked us to make the trophy. So this is just a trophy from a trophy shop, chopped in half. So the act of chopping is the thing which changes the meaning of the trophy, is the language itself, so the chop. More chops. This is a project we're working on at the moment. It's just going through a bit of a financial crunch. But it's part of a regeneration of a town called Middlesbrough in the north of England. Typical post-industrial scenario. This is an old dockside. Master planned by Will also, with a variety of architects involved. So around this old dock. We're working on, we were given a volume, which is 30 by 30 metre cube, and told to turn it into housing. And like 30 by 30 is just the worst size you can possibly have for something which is supposed to be housing. And it's far too deep. What we were thinking about here was really ways in which you could combine various different building types. So that, you might have a fairly boring apartment building which sits on top of a Swiss chalet. The whole are to do with this problem of the 30 by 30 metre cube. How can you somehow get light into the apartments? So essentially it's a very boring building with something weird happening at the bottom and something weird happening at the top. A kind of combination of vernaculars and generics. It's got these sort of Cape Cod houses on the top. And within the section it starts to have this landscape cut into it. Roots up through it, gardens and so on. Balconies. So here, the idea of the cut, or the idea of the sort of collage, becomes a way of remaking what's a very, very generic building type. It's also a way of introducing variety within the apartment types. Sometimes language is enough on its own. We were asked to try and master plan a set of existing buildings for an art school in the south of Holland in a town called Boxtel. The buildings they had were absolutely fine. There was nothing too much wrong with them, apart from the fact that they had nothing to do with each other. There was a bit of it built in the 19th century, then there was something from the 50s, something from the 60s, something from the 70s, something from the 80s, and then porter cabins. I think most educational buildings stopped getting built in the 1980s, and then it's just porter cabins after that. Like I say, they kind of worked. They kept the rain out and so on, but they didn't congeal into anything which had any sort of presence or any life to it as an interior. These are shots of it as found. So entrances you didn't know where it was, set back from the street, so you wouldn't be able to find out. But very significant location. On the one hand, there's an old castle, and on the other side, there's a cathedral. Both very rich in terms of design. One part of the project was trying to tie together various spaces. This is to do with like hollowing out, breaking down walls, making connections, and so on. Making public spaces within the school. So all the blue becomes open space. Opening up views so when you walk into the school, you can see what's going on. You can see into the workshops, you can see stuff happening. There's also an idea of how it can start to have a presence. We began to think of the idea of a ruin. This is a painting by Patrick Colford. We're thinking about buildings inside ruins. We began to look at how you might be able to wrap the existing set of buildings with this kind of fake facade, which was disconnected from any of the actual buildings themselves. What we were looking at here was developing a language which we started to call pop Gothic, partly to do with its kind of pop art references, but also to do with the fact that when you went into the school, you went into the workshop, you saw like 25 Marilyn Mansons operating very dangerous lathe equipment. So what we're using here, we're using pattern, and we're using these freestanding large-scale decorative objects as a way of reorienting the building, saying, okay, well, here's the entrance, here's the sign, here's the background. All of these buildings which were built at different times begin to congeal into something which has a kind of connected presence. Both in the exterior and the interior, you start to see ruins appear. The ruins are actually made with this really sophisticated concrete company. They're made with a mould which was had various sections made of polystyrene which could be pulled out so you could get variety within these modular units. And here they are being craned in. These are the kinds of patterns we were looking at, which were designed by this local monk, which were given to us. You imagine working with an art school for a client. Imagine how many creative people have got really good ideas for a project. It was a nightmare going on. Have like bits of paper thrusters. One of the things was this pattern, which we started to use. You can see it painted onto the existing building at the background. You can see it being used as a floor surface at the entrance here. So here, language is just being used as a way of manipulating architectural experience, not actual architectural volume itself. And as this screen traverses the building and comes around to various different points, its language changes. You can see how it's separate from the existing buildings. The same is used in the interior. This is the castle that's nearby, like totally Disneyland, but kind of authentic. So here it's about the surface treatments, which are giving it both a language, but also giving it accent and kind of practical things like wayfinding and so on. So I suppose this is a sort of practical application of taste, not space. It's the taste which is allowing the buildings to work properly. The taste is a sort of functional attribute. So what do you do architecture that communicates? What do you do with language? What do you try and tell stories? This is architecture that's telling two stories at the same time, kind of double speak. It's a very normal house, camouflage pattern applied to it. This is the interior. So here you've got the language of the object itself and the language of the pattern. Somehow, when you place the two together, it generates a third meaning. Someone described this as an interior fit for homeland security, which I think is quite a nice way of thinking about it. But the pattern itself brings a meaning with it and applied to an object which already has its own meaning. In a similar way, this project's dealing with an idea of fun and an idea of non-fun. It's on a Dutch beach resort in the North Sea. It's kind of a place you go and play slot machines and get drunk in the summer. And it's got the lovely seafront with blow-up gorillas and big neon parrots and all kinds of fun stuff going on. Which is the kind of stuff that we love. Finding ourselves in this sort of location is very difficult to out-fun 60-foot neon parrots. So we started to think about kind of opposite to fun. So this is trying to recall, I suppose, an idea of monuments. In this case, again, it's not really a monument to anything. In fact, it's a non-monument or an unmonument for various linguistic ways of trying to undo the idea of monuments. On the top there's a little house, and the house goes on fire every 30 minutes in high season. What it actually is a thing for a guy to sit in who looks after bicycles. It's like a bike park, like a car park, with a fence around it, with a bike, and you pay the guys to look after it. So it's drawing on this sort of fun architecture, kind of Vegas-ish architectural event, but within much more sober language. And it ended up on a Dutch stamp. Another way of telling stories when it goes wrong. This is a small project for a folly in the grounds of a stately island in the north of England. The follies have got this picturesque tradition, often historical objects placed in a kind of idealised nature. This was what we were remaking. We found it in a book. We thought, what a great picture that is. We thought we'd remake it. So it's a scaled down Romanesque church, but it's covered in this material which you usually find outside second-hand card dealers or kind of West End musicals. You see there's a big statue of Freddie Mercury in London with this shimmering stuff behind it. So it's a really cheap kind of tawdry material, but really amazing. When the wind blows, these little things shimmer. It's as though you spent $1 billion on really high-tech equipment. It's amazing stuff. So this coats it like it's sort of like it's going out dancing overnight, and coating this on the whole fairly traditional form. So this material is also about a reinterpretation of this idea of the folly and nature. So as the wind blows, it's kind of wobbling around. So if in the article, the language is being used to reorient resistance to the buildings, here we're using storytelling as a way of, I suppose, generating the architecture itself. This is a project in Holland. It's a suburb of Rotterdam. And its context is kind of interesting. You can see the bottom half is the town. The top half is a huge oil refinery, a big shell refinery. You can see in this picture here. Typical post-war new town. The bottom, massive industry at the top. Quite a strange location. This sort of very generic, kind of socialist, utopian new town. But a tremendous amount of nature. You can see all the trees there. There's Highland cattle wandering around. It's kind of a strange contradiction between the municipal and the natural. When we were initially asked to get involved in the project, we were just asked to come and visit this place and see what we thought of it. And we began to think that there was perhaps an imaginary town, one which didn't physically exist, but people thought they were living in. And we saw it in places like this, front gardens, with a tremendous amount of stuff. Stuff which was kind of dreaming of being in another place, living in another place. So you can see here some of the things. You've got a carriage lamp, anchor, some topiary, rockery, something to tie a massive ship up to next to a very small pond. So what we're looking at here is what these references might be. Also how scale might be. So a rockery might be a view of the Alps as you're sitting on that bench. So sort of an idea once again of this DIY culture being significant and I suppose being a sophisticated form of design in itself. So various other moments where you see perhaps front garden dreaming of being a bucolic Dutch landscape, or here just a carriage lamp spliced into the state municipal power line, a juxtaposition of aspirations. We were then asked to think of some things which might work, which wasn't really a program. We began to suggest things which we thought might be appropriate. The first thing, obviously, was a pet cemetery, a very significant kind of urban moment that could form a very strong bond with the landscape. Another was a relationship to a highway, this big highway that passes sort of north of the town. But the town has very little presence within Rotterdam. So this is a kind of a version of the Hollywood sign, in this case providing small huts for hobbies to be carried out into pigeon fencing, I think was the proposal for these ones. So sort of super large letter facades with absolutely tiny buildings at the bottom of them. As the project kind of went on, we began to be obvious that what it was about was making a community hall. So we're interested very much in something which was a very specific architectural language, something which was very rich, which said a lot about this place, which on the whole looks currently very generic. So here's St. Mark's as a community hall. On the other hand, being realistic, this is the local vernacular. This is what it's like. These are the kinds of buildings which get built along the highway. So this is our neighbour. So what we were looking at through the design process was something which aspired to be this, but was actually this, and built on a budget of this. In order for the project to happen, we had to get people involved. There was only us and a small group of clients without any money, people who wanted something to happen without any money. So we needed to bring together both the community and some money. So we started to make what were really kind of visions, which we intended to convince people to get engaged. So this is a vision of you can see the hall, the big sun, profile to it, and then a park. And the park was a thing full of all sorts of activities. So outdoor cinemas, playgrounds and so on. Here's early exploration to this idea of the kind of talkative, generic shed. Massive sunrise. We're starting to see industrial skylight. There's the chimneys of shell. Big text, references to the natural environment, these sort of tree holes in the exterior. So explorations in elevation. And the plan beginning to evolve. But this time we managed to convince someone to invest in the building, and we found members of the community or groups within the community who were going to occupy it. And the vision for the park began to take shape, which was a lot to do with the funding as well. So the major elements, so there's a big hill in the background. Obviously it's an unusual thing to find in Holland, a hill. But it's also a device for bringing money into the project. This is using and cleaning contaminated soil from other developments in the area. There's a big lake. This is used for draining the sodden soil of Holland. And it's a lake in the shape of Holland itself, so it's a kind of inverted, drowned Holland. There's the sort of pink and blue thing is a giant-sized patio. Do you have this stuff in the States called crazy paving? Is that? We have back gardens in Britain and in Holland as well. You have this stuff called crazy paving, which is like smashed up bits of stone put together in a sort of crazy way. Often it's kind of pink and bluish in colour, sort of fake reconstituted stone. In this case, it's scaled up to a civic proportion. We also had to make models which were again used to engage the community as well as explore the design. And develop various small programs. These are things called hobby huts, which are supposed to house a variety of activities, things which have outgrown someone's house, possibly hobby groups, but also small businesses. The first occupants are a group of people who used to work at Europort, which is very close by, which is the big roll-on, roll-off container port. These guys are retired and they make remote control, incredibly accurate versions of container ships. And then they put on displays, they go around Holland putting on displays of these amazing things. So they're the first occupants of these things, which again are kind of, they're pretty basic buildings. They're essentially sheds, but they're somehow made slightly more glamorous, slightly more civic. So, taking on a kind of a sort of miniaturized urbanism, if you like. A variety of other elements, objects, bridges, which are always trying to say something, either directly through text or through their form. Some things which hit the dust. This was supposed to be for the pet cemetery. But they had a big argument with the Arboretum. They didn't get on at all. Big fight. So various bits of landscape. A tremendous amount of investment. The project's been going a long time, so we've run a sort of few test versions of it, weekend versions of the project. So this is in a big car park in the centre of town. A sort of approximation of the architecture, an approximation of the programme, lasting 3 days, to see how it congeals as a kind of community focus. So this is the sort of stage set for those festival days. Kind of ad hoc Versailles moments. So it's very near completion of the project. So various bits are being transported across Holland. This is a bridge on its way. There's elements been arriving. There's sort of narratives of the project which is about both the specific and the generic. So specific in terms of language and generic in terms of construction. Also through the artificial and the natural. So there's a series of benches which are just logs with these things cut into them. And plastic coated insertions. And the building's almost done. and it's kind of what it set out to be. It's a very generic building, incredibly cheap, almost no detailing to it at all. It comes as a sort of standard package, but then dressed up with various either cuts into the surface or applications around it. So the first thing is this sort of crown which goes all the way around it, which starts to be the thing which is communicative. It's like a sign that's wrapped around the whole building, so you can see text in it, you can see stuff which is approximating the skyline, you can see a couple of the shell chimneys in the background. The wooden panelling also becomes treescape and roofscape and so on. You can see the surface of the building itself cut into tree shapes in this corner. The entrance is marked with this huge polystyrene tree sculpture that's been sprayed with a glittery gold plastic finish to it. And so the sign kind of wraps around and comes down to the ground. It's got a fake structure holding it up, but it's kind of eaten into by a narrative of the specifics of the town, so nature and industry. Various bits open up. This treescape opens up as a cafe. And here you can start to see what a weird situation it is. It's kind of Blade Runner in the background. Then you have this interaction between the very sensible building that's actually there and this stuff that's wrapped around it. So the views into it, views are looking at the back of signage, essentially. And this is the path being laid, so you can see the hill being constructed and you can see the chimneys of shell behind you. I think it's amazing. First, like, this is what would happen like if you're trying to make Mars habitable. This would be the photograph you'd take, although he'd probably wear a spacesuit. But I think what's happening with this project really is an idea of trying to make a language which is specific to a location, even though the location itself is fairly generic, but to uncover the quirks of community life and the specifics of context, which allow the generic to become specific. And in that way, kind of inventing a new form of civic expression, so a place which belongs, a symbol of the place in which this building is. I'm at the end now. You'll be pleased to hear. I think what we're interested in the fact really is trying to explore relationships between things which don't seem to have too much relationship on the surface. So, for example, the gardens of the Palace of Nymphenburg and generic car park of contemporary space, or perhaps kind of extravagant Baroque stylings with what might be the sort of last remnants in the chrome of a car. So these connections between either the aspirations of history and the realities of the contemporary scenario, or it's to do with the way of bringing too many things into the fold, so something that should be generic which starts to become specific. Architecture which takes on language into which it should have rejected 100 years ago. But these are means of making architecture which connects with the culture that surrounds it. Architecture which rejects taste, rejects decoration, rejects ornament, is working in a different way to how most of culture works. We think architecture is simply a function of culture, it's not something separate to it. And to that end, the idea that architecture is both as ephemeral and as important as fashion, and also engages with idea of taste and taste cultures is really significant. Thank you very much. I think we've got an aspiration as an architectural practice to I think, as you say, work between tastes. But most often, architecture works as a signature. So architects work with a signature as a means of recognising their work and recognising where the architecture is occurring. But I think if you take taste seriously and that you acknowledge multiple tastes exist and they're equally valid, equally interesting, then I think it means that it's important to try to work between them, to say, okay, you can work within genre or multiple aesthetics simultaneously. And I think that's one of the things that you recognise in that first image of the house with the half timbering and the fireplace. What's amazing is that it's not singular, that it's multiple. It's so many different things. It's almost impossible to say, what is this thing trying to do? And I think the same, in some senses, is the same thing with the church. It's the idea that you can collage together a variety of objects which are disparate. I think there's different ways in which taste works, and it's not simply about making something whole. So both of them are kind of just incomplete or referring to multiple situations and placing them together. It's very different when it's found, when it's vernacular. It's something which you can, I think in this case, we're looking at to sort of appreciate. It's very difficult to manufacture that. You can't synthesize it, I don't think. I think what you can do is to acknowledge within, what we try to do is to acknowledge in the work that maybe our taste isn't necessarily the only taste, that it can engage with either with clients, in the taste of the advertising agency, which ones do you like, being very open about the process. And in other cases it's about sort of trying to learn a language, or trying to discover a language which doesn't quite exist yet, which is the case in the last project that I was doing, was trying to make sense of a scenario that evolved without anybody really designing it. How's that? Yeah.
One is sincere, the other one is more ironic. And that seems to be the crucial difference in the two kinds of taste. And it's one that often divides tastes. So that's what I think about is how you see those two.
Yeah, I think the issue of irony is important. I don't know, we're often accused of being ironic. And most of the time, we're not being ironic at all. We're kind of very, very, really sincere. I think it's obviously different because it's synthesized, because it's not, it's not authentic in the same way that working class taste can be seen as an authentic phenomenon. Yeah, there's authentic, inauthentic, half timbering, and then there's inauthentic, half timbering. The complexities of taste. Yeah. Well, the contemporary, I think, is far more interesting than the modern as a style. There's plenty of people doing modernism, whether it's slightly wonky, slightly curvy, or straight. We don't need to keep doing that. I think what we attempt to do is to explore a kind of, I suppose, contemporary language rather than the modern language.
That is part of the contemporary language you're doing that.
Well,
Or you would say, well, this kind of contemporary is not that contemporary.
it's just not very interesting. I suppose what
I'm trying to locate your like your position in terms of, maybe the actor's thinking as well to deal with multiple cases, but not large cases.
I think, I think we do. I think we work with abstraction a lot. We work with, whether that's abstraction taken to something that has meaning, totally extracted, or whether it's halfway through that process. A lot of our work is, I suppose, like pop art, is like kind of halfway through the process of abstraction, where it's very obviously representational, whether it's directly lifted as a sort of ready-made, like in the case of the church, or whether it's more of a graphic element, like in the art school, in the last project with the trees and the skyline and so on. No, I don't think that. Yeah, I think you're right. It is part of language. I think it is part of the stuff that we do as well. It's just probably overwhelmed by the boldness of the kind of graphic which covers it up. Today. I think it's present in projects. But I think it is really the idea of abstraction. It's probably the moment where it connects a variety of taste cultures.
I think my question I think you're trying to figure out a lot is how are you different from how are you different from generation? Or are you just an ideal or are you in fact taking this to a whole other level? So if that whole postmodern moment was a rejection of modernism, is your rejection of postmodernism any different from that, or are you just doing the same thing?
I think the difference is that many of the projects are engaged, say, with a community, for example, where it becomes significant sort of social act rather than a rhetorical act. I think it's also slightly less concerned with history and more engaged with just a contemporary landscape and kind of objects and architectural tropes and scenarios which occur within media, I think, probably more. So more than architectural canon, if you like. So I think it's open more to a variety of languages and references. And I think it tries to bathe in receives imagery probably more imagery. It's less boring. It tries to be quite exciting. And Robert Venturi described our work as not boring, but in a good way. And I think we're there is very proud of it being ugly and ordinary, being asked to be quite spectacular within the constraints of the project. We think that's important. It's a kind of contemporary blingness to it is significant. So in some ways, it's a kind of direct continuation of the same set of ideas. In other ways, it's kind of relevant 30, 40 years later. But I'd insist that the context for that set of architectural ideas are far more present now than they were then. And it seems strange to me that it can be forgotten when it's incredibly relevant and engages with a lot of the problems which surround us. So in that sense, we're quite happy to follow in those footsteps and to sort of pick up the baton which was dropped in 1987, perhaps, or whatever the date was. Yeah, there's a big difference, for example, between American pop and British pop in the 60s. Because American pop was boring, and British pop sometimes was much more folksy or kind of more intellectual. So I think there is something about context. I think there's also strange phenomenon in architecture where that sort of work is corralled into a very small place. Whereas if you look in art, for example, the idea of artists dealing with the idea of representation spreads from pop art outwards into many other areas. And I think within architecture, it's very closely tied. Anything which is representation is very closely tied to that moment within architectural culture, which I think which kind of limits it, and it kind of holds it within a particular frame of reference. I'm much more interested in the way that art, for example, deals with representation in the way architecture does. I mean, architecture is kind of not considered to be a significant enough issue. For example, it's the same taste is considered not to be something worth discussing. It's too lowly. And I think representation is the means by which you can engage with a whole set of ideas, a whole set of context, a whole set of audiences, and so on. Which seems to me ridiculous to ignore that as an architectural topic.
Okay, time for a quick setup. Thank you.
Sure.